Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. It is no news to listeners that October 7th thrusted many Jewish students on campus into the spotlight as they were forced to deal with the reckoning of the staunch and constant anti-Zionism that we saw piling up on American college campuses. This in turn created a generation of bold, well-spoken student activists, the like of which are really transforming the Jewish world with both their experience, their wisdom, and their passion for the work. One such people is Sabrina Soffer, a writer, researcher, activist, somebody who spoke at the Jewish March on Washington in November 2023. And in this conversation with Sabrina, we talk about Mizrachi Jews and what the liberal Jewish community gets wrong when it comes to including them in community. We talk about the trend of Jews on campus both becoming better supporters of Israel and also the knee-jerk reaction of some Jews becoming anti-Zionist. We talk about lawsuits against universities. We talk about Qatari funding on universities. We talk about Hillel. We talk about Chabad. We really talk about all campus-related things. And now I bring you Sabrina Soffer. Yeah, so you just graduated college, just that, just for listeners' background. And it's interesting because I've obviously been working on campus for 8 years, and I'm sort of half feel bad a little bit for your class, and also just see the way that it's empowered a lot of young people like yourself. Talk me through that. When you got to college 4 years ago, obviously far before October 7th, obviously you probably didn't envision, eventually the large platform that you'd be on, but did you want to get involved in Jewish life and pro-Israel life? Did it sort of just accidentally happen after October 7th? Kind of walk us through that.
Sure. Yeah. So I came in 2021, and I had no idea that there would be such anti-Semitism. And I was very open about my identity, my heritage, my family. And when I introduced myself in classes at the beginning, I would say these things and I would get some really strange looks. Ultimately, I would feel very excluded. And I had heard other stories of friends who were told some very negative things based on their support for Israel. And I really didn't understand why. I was perplexed at the fact that Israel was not considered the epitome of social justice. And I myself was very much moved by the social justice narrative that was prevalent in the United States, particularly on the progressive end of politics. So I didn't really understand why Israel, as the democracy that it is, especially in the Middle East, didn't fit that criteria. So over time, I had initially enrolled to be an international affairs major, veering toward Middle East studies. And one day, after some incident that happened in class where there was a dialogue shut down, I told myself, okay, I need to explore what's going on behind the scenes that's leading to this. So I changed my major to philosophy in order to excavate the philosophical underpinnings of what's giving this animosity for Israel and ultimately for the Jewish people. And I also found later down through my college experience, when I was still interested in Middle East studies. So I would go to the Elliott School of International Affairs Institute for Middle East Studies events, and I would find that the very same rhetoric that was being aired in these panels or in the classroom by these professors was the very same rhetoric that was being used in the protests. So this was very interesting finding to me. And I eventually realized that really the faculty and the inaction of the administration to really do something about this was the ground zero for what I call the pipeline of hate to begin. And eventually it erupts in the aggression we see on the streets. And here in Washington, D.C., we just saw it mark its very end with the murder of the two embassy staffers. So yes, I did not expect it, but it was a journey of excavation. And I know you said you feel sorry for students like myself. And yes, in a way, it's horrible what's happening on college campuses. We all know, and there needs to be accountability. But I think it's a lesson that students need to take forward and say, you know what, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do something about it and refuse to stay silent. Because if not, then it's just going to continue.
No, it's totally, yeah, I think you totally have both of those. I mean, anytime you have sort of hardship and pressure, it strengthens some people, and then other people, I think, not just can handle it, but I think that to expect an 18-year-old to come to campus ready to battle every day is just a very high bar. And so I'm sure this
Right,
happened
of
to you.
course.
Yeah. And so, just over the years, a number of students who either transfer to different universities, I'm sure you had that also, or just I talked to a lot of parents of high schoolers and they said, okay, I'm only applying to one of these, I don't know, 12 universities that are considered quote unquote safe for Jews. It's just sort of a sad paradigm. I mean, when I was an undergrad, this is now, I graduated 10 years ago, there was still anti-Israel stuff. I was there in both through 2012 and 2014, different wars of Israel with Gaza, but it was like maybe 2% of this. And I always told students over the last couple of years, the worst day I experienced in undergrad, maybe there was some BDS resolution. I went to UCLA and maybe, there was one of these long 6-hour meetings where you'd get all these, pro Hamas supporters there. The worst day I experienced is like an average day last
Mhm.
November, last December. And it was that crazy in terms of just the rhetoric being turned up. So definitely props to you for all of that. The other thing, one of the things that I've said a lot on this podcast before, and I feel like it's impossible to actually trust any objective data here because everybody just wants to tell an interesting story. But we hear so much about young Jews becoming anti-Israel. I've actually seen the opposite. I've seen a lot of Jews like yourself, like students we have on our campuses, become much more engaged in both Judaism and Israel. I've seen a lot of Jews internally become more pro-Israel, but they're just, understandably fearful to express that. And then a very, very small percentage of people who after October 7th actually move towards the anti-Israel side. But obviously anytime you read news on this, everybody's just interested in the sort of minority of the like, oh, these 4 Jews voted for, I don't know, Mamdani in New York. But I'm curious just from your vantage point, I mean, what do you make of this, these constant headlines of young Jews turning on Israel?
Sure. So I really see it in three different strands. You have the October 8th Zionist phenomenon, where you have Jews who were more silent before, who after October 7th said, okay, I'm going to fight. And then you also have the ones who were doing it before October 7th, like myself, which kind of falls into that category. But then you have the October 7th Jews they succumbed to the fear and said, okay, after October 7th, there's so much anti Semitism, I'm going to stay silent. And then you have the third strand, which is the Jews who, after October 7th, said, okay, now I'm going to be anti Israel because they see what's going on in Gaza and blah, blah, blah. But I do think that that particular strand of Jews is, number one, a minority, but it is it's an appealing narrative that they put forward. And I can explain why. So I found that a lot of these Jews don't really have a strong sense of Jewish identity, and they turn to what appears most virtuous and politically progressive in their social climate. So, among their friends, among progressive social circles. And today, unfortunately, and the reality is that is an anti Israel idea. To be progressive, you cannot support Israel. So they want to feed into that narrative, whether they truly believe it or not. They want to do it so they feel a sense of belonging and a sense of like rooted identity with their friends. And that's why they turn. And I think that that's actually becoming more and more appealing the less Jews and Jewish educators make it so important that Jews actually learn about their heritage, their tradition, the wisdom that Jewish people have endowed civilization, and why it's really so important to stand with Israel, because really Judaism and Zionism are inextricable. You can't separate the two. But I don't think that they know that, or even if they do know that, they overlook that in order to acquire a sense of belonging.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, one of the topics that I teach about at UC Irvine in Jewish studies classes is, the 1800s was such an interesting century for Jews because that was the century. I mean, really, it started in the 1700s a little bit, but like 1800s is usually classified as the time where this thing called Judaism as a religion was being defined mostly by Western European Jews that was somehow separating the religious element of Judaism from, I don't know, what it meant to be a Jew in the medieval period, which was some mishmash of what today we would call nationality, ethnicity, religion, entire social sphere, right? There was none of this differentiation. And a lot of people, I think, have just naively carried that into the present where you get a lot of Jews saying essentially, well, Israel has nothing to do with my Jewish identity. My Jewish identity is a religion. The sort of irony that I'll add is most of them aren't that religious. So I always sort of, look a little bit funny on people that vehemently define Judaism as a religion, don't practice that religion, and then speak as proud Jews, right? It's sort of always a little bit of a mix up there. But I think, we've really been wrestling with this for the last 200 years. It's also why when you talk to a lot of both Mizrahi Jews and also obviously most of Israel is Mizrahi now, they just don't even understand this conversation. I mean, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but because this is the first time I'm meeting you, my wife is Persian, and so I'm very, absorbed into the wider Los Angeles Persian community. And distinctions that we might have in the Ashkenazi community of, okay, are you pro-Israel, Zionist, anti-Zionist, that like kind of makes sense in an Ashkenazi context. For them, they're like, oh, of course, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and Israel's a part of Jewish identity. Like they don't even understand the question. And so I think that's also important, whenever I talk to people about this differentiation, and I am willing personally to say there can be types of anti-Zionism that aren't ipso facto anti-Semitism. That's another conversation. But whenever I'm talking to students about this, both Jewish or not Jewish, I always start with, this conversation is a very Euro/Ashkenazi centric conversation. And I just want to flag that because for millions of Mizrahi Jews, for them, this is a distinction without a difference. These are just two words that mean the exact same thing. So I just wanted to get that out there. I don't know if you have anything to follow up on, and then I want to dig in on campus a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually the fact that you bring up the Mizrahi Jewish topic is very close to my heart because I am Mizrahi. So my dad's family is from Egypt, and I grew up hearing stories of my grandfather's family being accused of being Zionist spies just because they were Jewish. And my grandmother's family, also from Alexandria, she saw the entire Jewish quarter being burned up in flames, and it's only because these were Jewish stores. So I would grow up hearing these things, and I said, oh, this will never happen again. We have Israel now in the West, we can't have these same sentiments. But then when I saw what was going on campus, the very same rhetoric, oh, you're acting as an agent of Israel, or you're voting for Bibi, therefore you're a fascist. And it's like, this is just an American, like one of my friends was told this is just an American Jew who's being linked to Israel. And if you look at the IRA definition, that is one of the components of anti-Semitism, is when you accuse a Jewish person that has nothing to do with Israel as being an agent of the country. And this is something that traces back years and has anti-Semitic motives. And ultimately, my family from Egypt was the only place they found refuge was in Israel, and some of them in France. So yes, the distinction when I would tell my family, my grandfather, my grandmother, and my dad, and even my mom, who is from Dagestan, and I can get into that too, which was a part of the USSR, those distinctions also were not fully understood, and nobody took me seriously until after October 7th in my family. In Israel,
the Ashkenazi community, I'll just add, I mean, does a really bad job at trying to understand Mizrachi Jews. Yesterday I did a podcast with Adam Lehman, the head of the CEO of Hillel International. So your podcast will drop, this episode will drop 2 days after that. So and that's one of the things that I tried to like push him on is, Hillel oftentimes says that they want to do events to cater to diverse Jews/Jews of color. I've never met a Mizrahi Jew who likes the term Jew of color, by the way. But we'll put that aside. But then in order to do it, they come out with these like almost laughable events that are definitely, one very blunt way to put it is most Mizrahi, I'm going to make a generalization, so excuse me, right? Like I'll talk about the Persian community. Most of them are quite conservative. But most of the time when Ashkenazi Jews are thinking like, oh, Jews of color, they must be very progressive. So, in order to court them, we must go more to the left and talk about diversity and everything like that. Whereas, it's obviously not what the Persian community wants, nor does anybody actually sit down with a group of Persian Jewish students and ask them like, hey, what do you actually want to see out of, liberal or pluralistic Jewish community? So definitely been one of the pet peeves of mine for a while. The other thing I'll add, just to get back to what you were saying before, to be a Jew in America, and maybe this doesn't even have the distinction of Ashkenazi or Mizrahi, but the Jews who ended up making it into America are sort of the lucky privileged Jews. And it was only after America shut its borders and, after World War I that Zionism really began to take off as sort of, a necessary movement, right? Before that, it was sort of this idealized movement. But then after 1920s, it was most Jews went on board because they're like, oh my God, there's nowhere else that'll take Jews. And so to be a Jew in America and rail against anti-Zionism is incredibly privileged. It's like, I don't know, if a boat is sinking and you make it onto the life raft and then helicopters come in to rescue everybody else. And you're like, do we really need helicopters, right? It's so noisy, right? You're like, okay, well, you have a little bit of a, privileged perspective. And then the irony of what you mentioned, Egypt's such an interesting case because anybody who knows Jewish history, I mean, Jews have been living in Egypt for, I mean, okay, obviously the Passover story, but even since then, I mean, in the 6th century BCE, there were Jews in Egypt. In the 1st century, huge Jewish community in Alexandria, right? Jews had lived there, on and off with relative, somewhat peace and quiet, depending on who you ask, for thousands of years. And then when Israel was formed, within 10 years, even though most of the Jews had very little connection to Israel, they were immediately suspected of being Zionists. I think there was one statement in, the Sinai War in 1956, where the head of Egypt essentially is like, well, all Jews are potentially Zionist spies, and so we should either kick them out, and a lot of Jews were hung. And so, the irony of this anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism conversation is the Arab world essentially made this conversation almost impossible to have, because there was a chance in history to divorce the two, but they actually, by accusing all Jews of being Zionists by dint of them being Jewish, the conversation essentially went out the window. And just the last thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it back to you. Obviously, the biggest Jewish community still in the Muslim world right now is in Iran. People are oftentimes shocked to hear that. But every time something happens, like obviously the recent flare up with Israel, there were, I think, 900 members of the Jewish community in Iran who were arrested and taken in for, very strict questioning and, probably worse, just by dint of them being Jewish. And these were, high ranking members of the Jewish community. And so it's very hard to, sit here in the West and say, well, in theory, we might be able to separate these two. Whereas, in the sort of like real world, right? The real world is definitely not college campuses in America. These distinctions really don't matter.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting that you say that. I have a story that kind of taps into this whole conversation. But so what happened was at GW, they established an anti-Semitism task force in fall of 2022, late fall of 2022. And I got a lot of opposition. I was appointed commissioner. I had to try to pass it in the student senate. And there were some organizations, SJP and JVP, who came to the floor and said, no, this is making the IRA definition the standard of anti-Semitism, and we don't want it. And plus, you're a racist and you're a horrible person, and we don't want you. Okay, fine. So what did I do? I said, look, I don't care about the IRA definition. I want you to look at history and tell me that in cases of history, in places where you saw anti-Zionism rise as an idea, Jews were forced to leave or they left. Do you really want GW's campus to look this way? And I said, this is a form of bullying that leads to exclusion and ousting of your peers, ultimately. Is that what you want? And that statement was met with death silence, because there's no way to oppose that. You can't contradict the facts. And I think this is something that people have to learn. And unfortunately, I think going back to your point once again, is that the education on Mizrahi Jewish history is very much lacking, even in Jewish studies departments. I've been lucky to have very good Jewish studies professors, but when I hear about my friends' Jewish studies curriculum, it's not as rich on Mizrahi Jewish history as it should be. And when you have the Middle East studies curricula in different Middle East programs, a lot of that is often centered on them defining who Jews are. And that does not consist of Jews from the Arab world, Jews who experienced life in the USSR. So Israel is kind of divorced from the Middle East, and thereby Jews are divorced from the Middle East, which makes their case that Jews don't belong in the Middle East, and then amplifies the anti-Semitic narrative. So it's a really big problem. And I think that story is just goes to your point.
Yeah, no, it's especially pernicious in Jewish studies departments. I mean, there's a lot to say about many Jewish studies departments across the country becoming anti-Zionist slash, dipping it, or at least if we want to be more conservative, we can say not fighting against anti-Semitism, right? And while being anti-Zionist and propagating it, but there's been this sort of mythical view of history that's arose. I sort of alluded to it before. And it has an interesting history. I'll give the theory first, and then we can talk about the history of it, which is that Jewish life in the Arab world pre-Zionism was, perfect. It's a really interesting theory because people are oftentimes surprised to hear where it came from. It came from mostly Western European Jewish scholars in the early 1800s, because they were making the argument to, wider Christian culture of saying, like, look, if Muslims in the 1100s in places like Spain and Morocco were able to treat us with complete equality in some golden age of Spain. You, for sure, in the post-Enlightenment, I don't know, 1870s in Berlin, like you should be able to do the same too. And so this was very much pushed by scholars. But obviously, recent scholarship has sort of shown that this was, again, it was polemical, right? It was, maybe we can debate about how much it's true, but definitely the strongest case is not true. But for some reason, some subset of the academy just sort of ran with this idea because I think it, fit their anti-Zionist aims. And so you still see this today. I mean, I teach Jewish studies and, I talk to students who are in other Jewish studies classes and they'll compare and they'll say, I always assign, there's this book by Mark Cohen. It's called Under Cross and Crescent. And
I've read it. Yeah, it's
it's
great.
really interesting. And in the first chapter, he basically talks about this. He says there's a myth and then a counter myth, and the truth, like most things, is somewhere in the middle. And I always assign it for any of my classes whenever I do anything about, medieval Jewish history or Jews in the Muslim or Christian world or anything like that. And I always have students say, oh my God, I took this other class by X, Y, and Z professor. And they said essentially life was perfect for Jews in the Muslim world, whether we're talking about the 1100s or whether we're talking about, I don't know, 1850s and the Ottoman Empire before Zionism. And it's so crazy how that idea, I mean, just on its face, it makes no sense. And even to the extent, I mean, again, I think the best comparison of what it might have been like, I mentioned Jews in Iran before, and it's only because, my wife still has family that lives in Iran, and I've gotten to talk to them when they come visit Los Angeles. And the way they live their life, I mean, they're dhimmis, right? In the strongest sense of the word, right? They don't have the same rights as Muslims. They know that. They're afraid to do certain things publicly. Again, on a day to day, they're not treated terribly, right? It's not like there are pogroms coming through the Jewish community, and they have some set of, civil rights, but it's nothing that we would consider to be, equality or anything that West. But it's so crazy that you have all these, very progressive Jewish studies and also Middle East scholars talking about this period of like, oh, this was the ideal, 1800s Ottoman Empire for Jews, when you think, okay, but you're essentially defending like a Jim Crow-esque for Jews type situation in the Middle East. Like we can debate about whether or not Zionism fixed it or caused other problems, but like the history there is just so faulty. So yeah, I think everybody sort of gets Mizrachi Jews wrong. It, definitely a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to like the benefit of teaching Mizrahi Jewish history in an honest and really rich way. I took a class called Jewish Muslim Coexistence in the Middle East and North Africa. And I sat in that class on the first day and I noticed a girl behind me having the same necklace as I did. Her necklace was the map of what I would call Israel and what she would call Palestine. And I said, oh dear, like if I introduce myself and she introduces herself, I already know that she's not going to like me because usually when I was on campus, usually students of that mentality that see the whole thing as Palestine don't want to talk to me. So long story short, I ended up sparking a conversation with her and she began to talk to me like a normal person would. And I ended up telling her my family story. I introduced myself. I shared where my family was from, the foods that my grandfather used to prepare, the culture that we had. And she said, oh, my mom is also from Egypt. And me and this Palestinian girl who eventually became the head of SJP and later she unfriended me. But for a good 5 months, we were like this, such good friends. And it's really unfortunate that after October 7th, she decided that she didn't want to talk to me anymore. But I think that that should be a model for the way that we teach this. And the professor was so careful in the way that he taught. He used Martin Gilbert's In Ishmael's House. That book is phenomenal. And it shows how there was, yes, both protection of Jews and persecution of Jews in Muslim lands. And we can't go back in history and we can't change what happened. But if we can build connections when we're learning about history, I think these kinds of relationships should be what we aspire toward in the future, hopefully in these tumultuous and very polarized times.
Yeah, 100%. One more historic tangent. It's funny. This is like a tangent to the tangent. I'm preparing to officiate the wedding of two grad students who both listen to the podcast. So I'll give them a shout out. And the first time I sat down with them to try to like figure out what we were going to do during the chuppah, they're like, just make sure not to go on a tangent about medieval Jewish philosophy in the middle of the chuppah. And I'm like, I'll try. But my medieval Jewish philosophy tangent for now, because he did not ask me to do that, is, I mean, even in the medieval ages, Moses Maimonides' son, Abraham Maimonides, actually founded a school of thought that was this mixture of Jewish and Islamic Sufi practice. And this sort of school of thought existed for about 100 years. And there were all these Jews who were essentially doing like, full prostration, and they were washing their hands and feet before prayer, and they were dressed in Islamic garb, and like, again, very much borrowing. And so there was, these times, and he would invite, Muslim scholars in to like help give, drashot at, on Shabbat, and he would actually go to mosques and speak. And so there definitely were these, periods of, maybe if we don't call them golden ages, like, I don't know, golden flashes for a
Yeah.
moment. And so it's sort of sad that it seems like that era is ending. I want to talk to you a little bit more about campus because I see you've been a part of like every single campus fellowship and group possible. Um, I sort of have here. I'll run a thesis by you and we can see what you think of it. I'm a little bit surprised, or I guess not surprised. I've long felt that there are just too many Jewish organizations in the campus space. It's not I'm not going to say which one I want to close, but it just seems like it's so hectic. I mean, I've been on campus between undergrad, grad school, and now for 15 years straight. And it just seems like every 3 months, like a new campus organization pops up and like takes a couple students and like silos it into this group, and the groups never talk to each other, and it's just chaos. And I'm curious what you make of just this general thesis. And I think October 7th, in some way, it was nice to be able to have all of these different groups, but in a lot of ways, it just made a centralized effort a lot more difficult when there was 15 other groups, all with their own interests and all with their own leadership. I'm curious what you make of that as somebody who probably spent a lot of time in many meetings with a diverse set of Jewish organizations.
Sure. So, yes, a little while ago, I wrote an article in the Jerusalem Post that said the thesis of that article was saying that these Jewish organizations need to come together and establish a roadmap for how we can move forward in a unified way. Because a lot of the times, these Jewish organizations compete for money, they compete over different conferences that they're doing. And this leads to really different interests going in different directions. And we don't really have a strategic way like the other side does. Because if you look at SJP and their whole, conglomerate of webs and different connections and the way that they unify to create a playbook and a strategy, to give them all the credit, we need to do the same thing, because I think that that would really help us get organized and say what we really want to do. And if we look at and what I've done with ISGAP now, the work of ISGAP is super important because it really exposes that this is not just about Jews. This is about an effort to subvert the West, right? So this is really a danger that we have in America and the broader Western world. And the Jewish organizations together, I think with evangelical Christian organizations and other allies, need to come together and say, here is our strategy. We all have a role to play in different parts. Like, let's say Hillel International really focuses on the campus life for Jewish students and provides them a community. That's great. That's one thing. Stand With Us really does a lot of the activism when it comes to anti-Semitism. Great. But we need to make sure that everybody's focuses are well defined and how we can build off one another to be successful. I think there are a lot of new groups that are being created because they see that there is a need to be filled. But I think that they should look at what's worked and what hasn't worked from other organizations that already exist and how they can work together to fill that gap in organizations that are already present. One thing that I would really like to see and that I think is missing is a group that teaches students their rights on campus and what to do when things go wrong and what to do before things go wrong. So, for example, how to document and report incidents. It's super basic, and I think the school should be teaching that. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, how to go about that is especially important. Making sure that you email administrators and professors when you have a conflict so you have that on record. I'm saying this because I found no other alternative by the end of my college career than to get accountability than by suing the university. Myself and 5 other plaintiffs have now sued George Washington University, and we have so much evidence, so much documentation of administrators being deliberately negligent toward our concerns. So the fact that we have all this evidence really makes our case. So if students eventually, and as many students have been doing, are filing lawsuits, which I really hope would not be the future of what it has to come to when it comes to getting accountability and restoring our campuses and the trust in our campuses, there should be organizations that, or efforts taken up by existing organizations that teach students how to do this. Also knowing their rights. For example, BDS is illegal in several states. When there's a BDS resolution on the table at your university, at a state school where BDS is illegal in that state, the students should know to take that to their university president and say, hey, per state law, this is not legal to have a BDS resolution here. Those things are seldom taught. And I think that there needs to be an organization or efforts led to emphasize those matters. Yeah.
Yeah, talk me through this lawsuit. I mean, I assume it's still in litigation, so I don't want to, you to ruin your case by talking about it here. But because I have heard of a lot of students, doing exactly what you did. Talk me through it. I'm curious, how has the university responded? What is sort of the goal of the lawsuit? Is it just to sort of drag their name under the mud? Is it, a concrete ask? I was just talking to a friend of mine who is involved in MIT. And I know at MIT also, there's a student that's now suing the school as well. It's somewhat of a similar case. But I would love to, any thoughts that you can share, I would love to hear about it.
Yeah, and I'll do precisely that. I'll say what I can share. So we filed on May 21st or no, it was 22nd, May 22nd, sorry, of this past year. So after I graduated, and the lawsuit really is unique because it goes to the heart of the issue. We not only file over Title VI discrimination, but we file over breach of contract. And that really goes to the heart of the issue that asks how is anti-Semitism cultivated and how is it nurtured in the university to the extent that it becomes an outpour of hate in the social sphere or in public square on campus and in the classroom as well. So how does that happen? And really, as I said in the beginning, is that the faculty and the deliberate negligence of the admin toward issues regarding the faculty and academia are really where it all begins. So that's really what the heart of the lawsuit is about. And the complaint, it was filed with Holtzman and Vogel. If people are interested, it's an 170 something page complaint. There are stories and allegations there from 6 students, myself included. So yeah, we're still in process, but that's really why I think it's so important. Because if you don't get to the root of the issue, you're just covering a festering wound with a Band-Aid, and that's not really going to solve it. People need to see where it comes from.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Well, I'm curious to follow up on that in a couple of months or years. I don't know how long it takes these things to get figured out. One of
Sure.
the other, okay, so I oftentimes have, for no irony or pun intended, these sort of dual allegiances between I have the Hillel hat. I've worked for Hillel as the rabbi for 8 years, and then I also teach Jewish studies and very into Jewish history and Jewish sociology. And so I've oftentimes spoken on the podcast, much to the chagrin of anybody who listens to this, about a lot of Hillel Chabad dynamics, because it doesn't seem like anybody really wants to discuss that in any case. And so you were obviously very involved with both, as a lot of students are. And I'm curious, what you can make, not necessarily on your specific campus, but just more nationally. Where do you see these two organizations that, all of these other organizations, these are sort of the two flagship ones on campus, Hillel and Chabad. What are each of them doing well? What are each of them doing that is not so well? Would love to hear just some thoughts on that. And I can get into some of my, pet theories.
Sure. So I think that both organizations are great. I'll start with that. Hillel International and Hillel on Campus are very different. I don't know the jurisdiction that Hillel International has over the campuses, but when I was with Hillel International, they supported me in ways that my campus Hillel did not necessarily do so. I thought that Hillel International did a much better job of emphasizing the Israel component. I was the chair of a content creators program that helped students engage on social media and create pro-Israel content on social media. And on campus, those efforts were not necessarily reflected. And there was actually one instance where I wanted to do a counter, not a counter protest, but just stand with a table outside Israeli Apartheid Week, where nobody would see me from that side, but just on this off to the side, with flyers talking about anti-Semitism, why the claim of apartheid is false, which I ended up doing, by the way. But the Hillel at my campus said that they wouldn't support me in doing that I could do it, but they would not join me in that effort. And that was very, very disappointing to me. And to be honest, ever since that experience, I felt a little bit, I would say, unwelcome, not necessarily by the staff, but just by the fact that the activism that I thought would be supported as it was reflected in Hillel International was not necessarily reflected on in my campus Hillel. But overall, the community of Hillel at GW is a beautiful community, and they support many students in many different ways. When it comes to Chabad, I was president of Chabad, so of course I have more experience there. The rabbi and his wife, of course, make students feel at home. It's a much smaller community that we have at GW specifically. There's, I would say, like, I know some Chabads get like over 200 people for Shabbat. We have about 70. So it felt like a really close, like homey community where really anyone is welcome. I even brought like a few of my friends from different organizations to come experience Chabad events. There was an anti-Semitism event that we did with government officials, and Hillel did the same thing, but I wish they would have collaborated more in those instances. But, you know, who knows if that's possible on a wider level. I do think that the Chabad form of Judaism is different than the Hillel form of Judaism. One is more conservative, more orthodox. The other one is more reform. And I think that having both options for students is great. But when it came to the activism, at the end of the day, the organization that ended up supporting me was Chabad, and really gave me the freedom to do different events, not only Israel oriented, but Jewish activism. And I see Jewish activism as holding like a Mimuna celebration where we educate students about, and I think Hillel did a similar one too, but when I was president of Chabad, we just did it this year, educating students about Mizrahi history and Israel and how Israel falls into the Mimuna tradition was really a beautiful way of doing that activism. So yeah, I mean, both are great. Both have their differences, and whatever students veer toward is phenomenal. But I wish that Hillel International would give a little bit more direction to campus Hillels, where there are some things that come out of them that are rather questionable. I know that at one Hillel, there was a JVP, the JVP protests and some JVT content that was being spread, and that should be absolutely not allowed, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the things I talked to Adam Lehman about was this question of pluralism, and how it's just much more difficult to have concrete positions under a pluralistic framework than under a framework that's much more, one thing. Whether that one thing is good or bad, that's a separate question. Hillel is an interesting model, and it's interesting that you said you wish that Hillel International has sort of more control. One of the things that I've long loved about Hillel, but also I can imagine for students, it ends up being both frustrating and confusing, is that local Hillels can essentially do whatever they want, right? Like most of the funding's local. Obviously, Hillel International, they offer grants and they host conferences and they host things for students, and like they obviously have a much bigger team. So if like a student of ours is really interested in X, Y, or Z thing, we can probably set them up through Hillel International. But I actually love the fact that on the local level, we as the Hillel leadership can kind of do whatever we want and make these decisions for ourselves. Now, that said, that obviously means that there's going to be a very wide range of, I always tell, because whenever people ask me about, other Hillels, I always say, Hillel, it really just depends on like who one or two of the senior staff is from any Hillel. And it's sort of crazy that it works like that. But because Hillel is pluralistic, I mean, one of the other things that I wrote down when you said, because I think it's a little bit of a failure of Hillel, is that you said that, Chabad is more conservative / Orthodox, Hillel is more reform. Hillel shouldn't be, I mean, I totally get why you see it that way, but Hillel should be pluralistic. And so one shouldn't leave, I mean, this is an indictment on Hillel, not you, but one shouldn't leave Hillel thinking, oh, Hillel's the reform, community, whereas Chabad is the conservative / Orthodox. So I think that that's definitely something that I think a lot of Hillels have to figure out. I mean, listen, it's a little bit, I guess I'll put it this way. Part of being pluralistic is you always have this question of who do you include and who do you exclude. And
Correct.
Hillel tends to have the position to be pretty inclusive. Now, I think JVP is sort of outside of the Overton window of even somebody who Hillel International would consider being sort of like a quote unquote mainstream member of Hillel. But at the end of the day, it actually, anybody can kind of open up a chapter Hillel and not be connected to Hillel International. So there was a movement about 10
Mm,
years ago when I
interesting.
was an undergrad. I forgot what it was called. Not Free Hillel. It was like something like
Open
that, but
Hillel.
like Open Hillel. There we go. Which was essentially like, we are Hillel, but we don't want to connect with Hillel International because Hillel International are quote unquote Zionist and we don't want to be Zionist. And so, you know, that's sort of the both benefit and detriment of Hillel is you really get this like really wide range versus Chabad that tends to be obviously different Chabad couples are different, but it tends to be a lot more of like this cookie cutter. If you go to Chabad at, I don't know, in New York or DC or Toronto or Los Angeles, it's not going to be vastly different experiences. The Hillel might be completely different because in one case he might have the only rabbi might be very progressive, X, Y, and Z, type person who's really interested in social justice, and that might be the rabbi. And then in other Hillels, the rabbi is just, a modern Orthodox rabbi who, you would think, oh, this Hillel is like pretty Orthodox and pretty traditional. And it just has to do with the hiring. But a lot of people are confused about that whenever I talk to parents about, because Hillel International will put out stuff and they'll say, well, is this your guys's? Is this not your guys's? The other interesting thing about Chabad is that there's been like an interesting shift in terms of like Chabad Zionism. Chabad has always been pro-Israel, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe was, definitely pro-Israel. He often met with Israeli prime ministers and very much, was very interested and passionate about, making sure that Israel thrived. But in terms of Zionism, Chabad was always sort of like hush hush anti-Zionist because of the secularity of the state and, all the reasons why I'm sure and
Yeah.
listeners have probably listened to other podcasts about that I've done. But that's been something that's been shifting. I've actually seen a lot of Chabads both on campus and also community Chabads like explicitly put up Israeli flags and explicitly do like pro-Israel educational events, like pro-Zionist education events. That's been a fascinating shift that
Wow.
I think is a great shift. Like I'm very happy to see it. And so
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be a question to support Israel, just like it shouldn't be a question to support the US or any other country. I think like the question of Zionism to me, and I'm sorry for cutting you off, but when you talk about, it's like they like one supports Israel, one wants open Hillel wants to be anti-Zionism, anti-Zionist, that's why we broke off. It's like I just think to myself, why is it even a question? It's a country that exists. And there should be no question as to whether it exists or not. You can have ideas about the ideology in the country and the religious and secular elements, but to be a Zionist just means that you support the existence of the state, period. That's it. And I just don't think that it should be controversial at all. I
yeah,
think
no,
by
I
even, yeah, I mean, yeah,
totally agree. Okay, we've been talking for a while. What else is on your mind? What have we not discussed?
I had a thought, but I forgot. Let me think. Um, yeah, I mean, I would also say that for students to really, because my goal as a student who graduated, I always want to help parents and students. A lot of questions I get is, should I send my student to a Columbia or a Harvard or an NYU? I think it's important to send the message to students and parents out there and say, you don't have to, it's not good or bad to go one way or the other. I think going to Columbia or Harvard makes a statement and saying that we're not going away, but also going makes a statement and says, okay, as a Jew, I'm kind of okay being here. So maybe you don't really feel comfortable with that. But what it comes down to me is, let's look at it in a normal light and say, if this university has the programming and the education that I want, don't look at the label, because I would advise anybody not to just look at the label of the school. Look at the programs, look at the professors, do your research. And if that's really the school that you want to see yourself and you feel like you'll get the best education that you can, go. But if you really feel differently, you can get a great education. It doesn't matter what the name of the school is. Just look at the program. And if you want to go there and make your voice heard, because you deserve an equal educational opportunity, as the law tells us, like any other student. And everybody will be there as a Jewish community to support you. So that's the one thing that I would say.
No,
Um,
that's a great point. It's something I tell high schoolers often whenever I'm like talking to groups of high schoolers, which tends to be quite often, and then inevitably it turns to college applications. And it's something I obviously didn't appreciate in high school. I went to a very, college preppy high school, and everybody was like the most important thing. And now looking, 10 years past college at just which friends of mine are thriving and doing things that they enjoy and are passionate about, and even, making good money. And there's basically zero correlation between like college name and how good of a school it was and how well people are doing now. And if anything, oftentimes sort of like the less top collegey names actually give you more opportunity because, if you go to Columbia, every single person who you meet is going to have been that person who's like the overachiever, every club. If you go to sort of like a lower ranked school, you can actually accomplish so much because, you sort of have the whole platform open. It's something I did not appreciate in high school, but, whenever I talk to, especially parents where they're like, my kid didn't get into this school and now their dreams are crushed. And I'm like, okay, well, I promise you they can accomplish whatever they want, regardless of what school they go to. So I think it's a great point. And I think it also fits into the Israel stuff as well. Again, I always sort of not belittled the question, but whenever before October 7th, parents would ask me, because UC Irvine has long been known as sort of like a very hostile to Israel and Jewish campus. Even when I ended up signing up to be the Hillel rabbi. This is 8 years ago. I got friends of mine calling me. They're like, "Are you crazy? You're going to UC Irvine?" And so, when I had parents calling me the years after that, I was like, "Listen, things are fine. It's great. Nothing will happen." And then now I'm a little bit less sanguine on that. When parents call me, I do tell them, I'm like, listen, these are some of the things students have dealt with. That said, it's made the community stronger and made the students that are, living up to the moment stronger. And so, but there is, I think, at least something to think about in terms of like it is a different college experience now than it was 10 years ago. And I think that's just a fact.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also, I also would want to just uplift the work that ISGAP is doing. I know I came here, you found me through ISGAP. But ISGAP has really done important work when it comes to these colleges. And I think it's really been able to influence the decisions of many students and parents because they're really exposing the amount of foreign funding, namely from Qatar, that's been going into the academia, especially at the elite universities. I mean, they've produced reports on Columbia, most recently on Georgetown, and also on Cornell University. And a lot of these universities, you see, the ones that we so revered are now proving themselves to really be in conflict and really allowing this anti-Semitism and even promoting it, allowing it to spread on their campuses. And I think the work of ISGAP definitely in this Jewish organizational space, even though it's not necessarily on campus, it really should be elevated by several Jewish organizations that do exist. And it's getting used on Capitol Hill and in other forums, but ultimately you need the data and you need the stories that prove what's going on, and the work of ISGAP has been tremendous in doing that. So I guess as my last point, I would just want to turn everybody's attention to their work because it's been so important.
Yeah, if you have like 3 more minutes, let's actually like go down that rabbit hole a little bit, the Qatari funding, because
Yeah,
that's
sure.
like long been something that people have talked about. I mean, I remember in high school, people were like, oh, Qatar is funneling money into like anti-Israel stuff on campus. But like 15 years ago, it was sort of like, okay, a little bit of like conspiracy theory. But in the last year, I think it's become like very clear that that's what's happening.
Yeah,
I actually just put out a podcast about how on social media, Qatar has been funding not just social media accounts. My YouTube videos have started getting like hundreds of anti-Semitic comments. And then I dig
yeah,
into like where these commenters are from. And it's like new accounts that were created in the last year. And I, try to track, other things they've commented on. And it's just like free Palestine on like anything that has Judaism or Israel in the title. Obviously, it's
right.
impossible to connect that back to specific countries, but it's sort of obvious that there is this sort of nefarious group of countries. Iran and Russia are obviously in the mix. India, maybe not the countries, maybe not this, but a lot of these troll farms sort of originate from India. But what can you tell people that know nothing about this Qatari influence? What's the sort of elevator pitch of what's going on?
Sure. Yeah. So Qatar is the helm of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the ideology that essentially drives jihad. And they have been compelled to use Western freedoms in order to hijack them and subvert the West and essentially promote or empower themselves in taking over America. And they use the anti Semitism in order to fragment us politically and on a social level. And they're doing this through the educational system. And this is really ultimately their goal is to empower themselves over the West. And this is something that a lot of university administrators should be wary of, but it seems that they brush it off. And they have been not abiding the law by failing to disclose the amount of foreign funding that they're receiving from them. So this is, I guess, a very short synopsis of what's been going on. And now a lot of that data has come to light, namely Georgetown, Cornell, Columbia, Harvard. I know there's no report on Harvard yet, but there's certainly research about Harvard getting such funding. And the academic programs are very clear. You can see the bias in the programs in being anti-Israel and anti-Western, anti-American, namely. And it also infiltrates to the FSJP, which is the Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine, and of course the Students for Justice in Palestine. And all these actors are working together really to undermine the West by using our freedoms to do so. So I would say that, now of course the federal government is very alert on these issues, but this momentum needs to continue also as a social movement to say that this needs to be like CARE, organizations like CARE that are civil actions groups, definitely need to be put on high alert. And ultimately, some of the work that ISGAF has been doing is saying that the Muslim Brotherhood needs to be designated as a foreign terrorist organization. And there has been movement on both sides of the aisle to promote this vision.
Yeah, I implore everybody to look into the Qatar thing because it is one of those things that if you hear it for the first time, it just sounds like a conspiracy theory, but then you just very basically and surface level follow the money, and it's all in public. And
Yeah, I mean, there's 13 reports that got produced that reveal that there have been tens of billions of dollars poured into U.S. universities since October 7th. And it's not only universities, it's going to K through 12 as well. It's molding the minds of impressionable children who are going to go to the
100%.
universities, and they're not given the alternative view. That's what's really the scariest part, is that this funding not only promotes a certain agenda, but they censor other points of view it's manipulating the way people think today. And at universities like Georgetown, which really is the pipeline to places like the State Department, that's our policies, right? That's US policy. The West, the freedom of the world really depends on America. So if our State Department looks in 20 years like a whole bunch of people that are supporting the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, the same one of ISIS, Al Qaeda, what's our world going to look like? And I guess I can end on this note in saying that if you want this to stop, you really have to keep exposing and continuing action against this very sinister movement.
Yeah, well, we definitely appreciate the effort. Sabrina, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Of course. Thank you for having me.